The jungle steamed, the rain fell in sheets, and through his scope, Corporal Jake Mendez could barely make out the target, an enemy commander over 800 yards away. Standard training said the shot was impossible, a fool's errand in this weather. His rifle, fitted with a barrel nicknamed Delaney's Folly by the men who didn't understand it, felt heavy in his hands. But Jake knew this was no ordinary rifle. He knew its secret, a flaw that had become a legend in the suffocating humidity of the Pacific. The lives of an entire battalion rested on this single, impossible shot, a shot that would never have been considered without one gunsmith's career-ending mistake. His mistake, their miracle. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The great workshop of the Springfield Armory existed in a state of perpetual, controlled chaos, a cavernous hall where the future of the war was being forged in steel and fire. During the early 1940s, it was a symphony of industry, a place where the air itself was thick with purpose. It smelled of hot metal, cutting oil, and the faint, sharp scent of sawdust from the stock shapers. Sunlight, heavy with floating dust particles, streamed through enormous, grimy windows, casting long, cathedral-like beams across the floor. The constant, overlapping chorus of lathes turning, hammers falling, and milling machines chewing through steel was the heartbeat of the war effort on the home front. In the center of this industrious world was Frank Delaney, a man who moved through the noise and motion with a quiet, unshakable focus. In his late 50s, Frank was a master gunsmith, a relic from an older, more patient time, yet his skills were more critical than ever. His hands, though permanently stained with grease and oil, moved with the delicate precision of a surgeon, each gesture economical and certain. His workspace was an island of obsessive neatness in the sprawling workshop, every tool cleaned and hanging in its designated place, every blueprint flat and weighted down at the corners. He was a man who believed, with an almost religious fervor, that a soldier's life depended on every thousandth of an inch. He was holding a newly finished Springfield M1903 barrel, its blued steel gleaming under the overhead lamps. With intense, unblinking focus, he ran a micrometer over its length, his touch so light it was barely there. The cold, smooth metal felt alive in his hands, a conduit for the immense weight of his responsibility. With every barrel he inspected, he saw the face of his nephew, a young Marine barely out of his teens, fighting somewhere in the suffocating jungles of the Pacific. That personal connection, the gnawing fear that was a constant companion, fueled his obsession with perfection. He couldn't be there to protect the boy, but he could ensure the rifle in his hands was flawless, a perfect instrument of war that would not fail him. His eyes, magnified by his spectacles, caught something, a flicker, a shadow on the steel that wouldn't even register to another man. He paused, running the micrometer over the spot again. A microscopic flaw, a deviation so infinitesimal it was functionally non-existent. He stared at it, his jaw tightening. To his right, a young apprentice, eager and still green, watched him with a mixture of awe and confusion. The boy couldn't see the issue, couldn't comprehend the source of the old man's sudden, cold stillness. Frank sighed, a sound of deep, personal disappointment, and placed the barrel on the discard rack. "Frank, that looked perfect," the apprentice said, his voice barely carrying over the din. "The gauge reads true." Frank turned slowly, his gaze heavy. "Almost perfect isn't good enough," he said, his voice low but firm, cutting through the noise. "Out there, almost is a lie. Almost is a jammed round when a bayonet is coming at you. Almost gets a boy killed. Remember that." He tapped the discarded barrel with a single, definitive finger, then turned back to his bench, the lesson over. The apprentice stared at the barrel, a perfectly good piece of steel by any reasonable measure, now destined for the scrap heap because of a ghost only Frank Delaney could see. Later that week, a suffocating heat wave descended upon New England, turning the armory into a sweltering iron box. The air was a thick, humid blanket that clung to the skin and made every breath feel like a conscious effort. The symphony of the workshop sounded sluggish, the rhythms of the machines seeming to labor under the oppressive weight of the heat. Frank Delaney felt it more than most. He was tired, the humidity seeping into his bones, making his joints ache and his hands feel slick with a constant film of sweat. He was guiding the cutting head of the rifling machine, a complex and delicate process that carved the helical grooves inside a barrel, the very soul of a rifle's accuracy. He watched the slow, precise journey of the cutter, his mind 1,000 miles away, lost in a prayer for a nephew he hadn't heard from in months. The oppressive air made his focus waver, his thoughts drifting like the dust motes in the air. It was in that moment of distraction that a heavy crate of steel blanks, carelessly handled by a pair of sweating workers nearby, slipped from their grasp. It hit the concrete floor with a deafening bang, a sharp, explosive sound that echoed through the cavernous space like a cannon shot. Frank jumped, his body reacting with a violent, involuntary flinch. His hand, slick with sweat and oil, slipped on the guide wheel of the rifling machine. It was for less than a fraction of a second, a movement so brief it was almost imperceptible, but it was enough. A cold dread, sharp and sickening, washed over him, instantly cutting through the haze of heat and fatigue. He knew. He didn't need to see it or measure it. He knew in his bones, with the instinct born of 40 years of devotion to his craft, that something was irrevocably wrong. He slammed the emergency stop, the machine groaning to a halt. He pulled the barrel, his heart pounding a heavy, panicked rhythm against his ribs. To the naked eye, the rifling grooves looked fine, a perfect, spiraling path. But he could feel it, a subtle, twisting deviation in the lands and grooves, a flaw not of material but of motion. It was almost artistic in its imperfection, a slight, unnatural wave in the steel. A profound, burning shame washed over him, followed by a surge of anger at his own momentary weakness. He, Frank Delaney, the perfectionist, the man who preached that almost gets a boy killed, had failed. The next day was clear and dry, a stark contrast to the oppressive humidity of the day before. On the armory's outdoor firing range, Frank mounted the flawed barrel onto a test action. He had to confirm the failure, to quantify the extent of his mistake. Each step felt like a walk of shame. He fired a series of 5 rounds at a paper target 100 yards away, the crack of the rifle echoing in the crisp air. Through the spotting scope, the results were even worse than he had feared. The groupings were terrible, scattered across the paper in a wide, unpredictable pattern that spoke of a fundamental instability. It looked like the work of a novice, not a master. Each scattered hole in the paper felt like a personal indictment, a testament to his lapse. He was staring at the target, his face a mask of grim failure, when a gruff voice spoke behind him. "What happened here, Delaney? Looks like you were shooting blindfolded." It was Sergeant Wallace, Frank's superior, a pragmatic, no-nonsense veteran, whose face seemed permanently etched with the memory of past wars. He looked from the scattered target to the rifle in Frank's hands, then back again, his brow furrowed. Frank's voice was tight with shame, barely a whisper. I slipped. The rifling is off." Wallace grunted, a sound that was neither sympathetic nor condemning, merely factual. He picked up the barrel, squinting down its length for a moment before shaking his head. "Well, it's useless now," he declared, his voice devoid of malice. "Mark it for scrap. We're making rifles, not paperweights." He tossed the barrel onto the workbench, the clatter of steel a final judgment. "It's a useless barrel." The name, spoken so dismissively, stuck. Mortified, Frank tagged the barrel with the scrap marker, the word useless, scrawled on it in grease pencil. He carried it to the scrap pile himself and tossed it onto the growing mountain of rejected steel, hoping to bury his single, glaring mistake under the weight of other, lesser failures. Several weeks passed. The flawed barrel lay forgotten on the scrap pile, slowly gathering rust under the late summer sun. Inside the armory, Lieutenant Hayes, a young, ambitious ordnance officer, was preparing for a new series of tests. Hayes was a different breed from the old guard like Frank. He had a scientific mind, a deep-seated curiosity about the why of things, and was less interested in tradition than in empirical data. His current project was to test equipment performance in adverse weather conditions, specifically high humidity and fog, environments that were proving disastrous for standard equipment in the Pacific. He needed another rifle for his humidity tests, a control subject to fire alongside the others. But the armory was running at full capacity, and spare barrels were scarce. His eyes fell upon the scrap pile, a treasure trove of available steel. Unaware of its history, and caring only that it was a barrel of the correct caliber, he requisitioned the one on top, the one with Usellas scrawled on its tag. The next morning, the firing range was shrouded in a thick, damp fog that clung to everything, muffling sound and reducing visibility to a mere 50 yards. It was the perfect laboratory for Hayes's experiment. He set up his instruments, meticulously recording the temperature, humidity, and barometric pressure. He fired the standard issue rifles first, and as expected, the moisture in the air sent the rounds drifting, the groupings opening up significantly. Then, he chambered a round in the rifle fitted with the barrel from the scrap pile. He fired, the sound of the shot oddly deadened by the fog. He looked through the spotting scope, and his brow furrowed. He fired again. And again. He pulled the scope away from his eye and stared at the rifle, then back at the scope. He walked downrange to the target, his boots sinking into the wet grass. The results were shocking, impossible. In the dense, humid air that should have sent the bullets flying erratically, the 5 shots had grouped together in a tight, single cluster, a ragged hole no bigger than a silver dollar. It was more accurate than any standard-issue rifle he had ever tested, even in perfect, dry conditions. He stared at the target, a look of utter disbelief on his face. He knew, with the certainty of a scientist who has just witnessed a miracle, that evening, long after the last shift had clocked out and the great workshop had fallen into a cathedral-like silence, Lieutenant Hayes found Frank Delaney. The old gunsmith was meticulously cleaning his tools, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only sound in the vast, empty space. He moved with a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. Hayes approached quietly, holding a set of paper targets. Frank looked up, his eyes guarded, and upon seeing the lieutenant, his shoulders tensed. He expected mockery, a final, public twist of the knife regarding his failure. Hayes said nothing at first, simply laying the targets on the clean, scarred surface of the workbench. The first was the scattered, shameful pattern Frank had fired himself. The second, fired in the fog, was a single, tight cluster of holes. "Mr. Delaney," Hayes began, his voice calm and measured, "I need to know exactly what you did to this barrel." Frank's face hardened. "It's scrap, Lieutenant. A mistake. There's nothing more to it." Hayes tapped the second target with a firm finger. "Your mistake produced the tightest shot grouping I have ever seen in these conditions. Tell me what happened." Frank stared at the paper, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. The tight grouping was an affront to everything he knew, a physical impossibility. He looked from the target to Hayes's intense, curious face, and the wall of his shame began to crumble, replaced by a profound, dizzying confusion. He slowly, haltingly, recounted the story, the oppressive humidity, the dropped crate, the slip of his hand on the guide wheel. He spoke of the subtle, artistic wave in the rifling, the flaw he could feel more than see. Hayes listened, nodding, his expression growing more animated with every word. He began to pace, his mind racing. "It makes a strange kind of sense," he mused, more to himself than to Frank. "Standard rifling stabilizes a bullet for flight in standard air density, but in heavy, moisture-laden air, the physics change. The bullet yaws, it drifts, but this flaw of yours, it must impart a different kind of spin. A counterspin, a gyroscopic effect that, in dense air, actually corrects the yaw. It bites into the humidity, using the resistance to its advantage instead of fighting it." He stopped and looked at Frank, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of discovery. "We need to be sure. We need to conduct more tests." Frank, still reeling from the impossible truth laid out on his workbench, could only nod. The 2 men, the old artisan and the young scientist, agreed to work in secret, using a makeshift humidity chamber cobbled together from a steam pipe and a canvas tent in a forgotten corner of the armory. Their clandestine tests over the next week confirmed Hayes's theory with stunning precision. In the dry, controlled environment of the workshop, the barrel was a disaster, its shots scattering wildly as before. But inside the hot, steamy confines of their makeshift chamber, it was a prodigy. It performed with a consistency that was nothing short of miraculous. Hayes knew he had stumbled upon a significant breakthrough, but he also knew the rigid, unforgiving bureaucracy of Army ordnance. He could never get official approval for a design born from a documented error. A barrel officially designated as scrap, the regulations were clear, and the old guard would laugh him out of the room for suggesting they mass-produce a mistake. So he decided to act unilaterally, to sidestep the system he knew would crush this fragile accidental innovation. He had a small, discretionary budget for experimental field modifications, a fund meant for minor tweaks and adjustments, not a full production run. It was a risk, a career-ending one if he was caught, but the image of the tight-shot groups in the fog was burned into his mind. He thought of the reports from the Pacific, of snipers struggling in the constant rain and humidity, of shots missed and lives lost. He found Frank late one night, the old man poring over the test data, his face a mixture of awe and disbelief. Hayes took a deep breath. "Frank," he said, his voice low and serious, "I'm commissioning a run of 50 of these barrels." Frank looked up, his eyes wide. "I'm calling it Project Delaney's Folly," Hayes continued, a wry smile touching his lips. "The name from the scrap tag seems fitting, but I need you to oversee the production. I need you to perfectly, exactly, replicate your mistake." A storm of emotions washed over Frank. Redemption, sharp and sweet, was tangled with a profound, gut-wrenching anxiety. He was being asked to intentionally, meticulously, reproduce the greatest failure of his long and storied career. The shame he had tried to bury was now being unearthed and enshrined as a blueprint. But then, he thought of his nephew, of the other boys fighting in those green, suffocating hells. If his one moment of weakness could give them an edge, could bring even one of them home, what was his pride worth? He looked at Hayes, the determined young officer willing to risk everything on a hunch, and nodded slowly. "I'll do it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. For the next month, Frank Delaney worked with a renewed, almost fanatical purpose. He spent days calibrating the rifling machine, adjusting the guides by fractions of a hair's breadth, trying to coax the machine into recreating the exact same slip, the same beautiful, terrible flaw. It was the most difficult and unnatural work of his life, a deliberate act of imperfection that required more precision than perfection itself. Thousands of miles away, the war ground on a muddy, rain-soaked island that was little more than a malarial swamp, Corporal Jake Hawk Mendez lay in his dugout, cleaning his rifle for the 10th time that day. The air in the Marine encampment was thick with the smell of rot, diesel fumes, and the ever-present, cloying scent of fear. Rain was a constant, a drumming, maddening rhythm on the canvas roof of his shelter. Jake was a sniper, a man whose entire existence was predicated on patience and observation. He was a hunter by nature, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a quiet, almost unnerving demeanor that set him apart from the other men. His spotter, a talkative but fiercely loyal private from Brooklyn named Russo, was currently complaining about the food, the rain, and the insects, a familiar litany that Jake had long ago learned to tune out. It was then that a crate was dropped off by a supply jeep, landing with a splash in the mud near their position. The accompanying note was maddeningly vague, a single typed line on a damp piece of paper: experimental rifles, specialized for humid environments. The snipers in the company gathered around, skeptical and wary. The rifles looked like standard M1903S, no different from the ones they already carried. They were tools of a deadly trade, and men grew to trust their tools. A new, untested variable was not a gift, it was a potential liability. Jake was assigned one of the new rifles. He took it back to his dugout and began the slow, methodical process of breaking it down. He cleaned and oiled every piece, his sensitive fingers searching for any sign of imperfection. As he worked, he felt something, a subtle, almost imperceptible difference in the balance of the barrel. It felt a fraction heavier at the muzzle, a nuance no one else would notice. He ran a cleaning patch through the bore and felt a strange, almost imperceptible catch in the rifling, a slight drag that wasn't there in his old rifle. He couldn't place it, couldn't define it, but he knew this rifle was different. He reassembled it, the smooth, oiled click of the bolt sliding home a familiar comfort in the miserable, dripping jungle. A week later, Jake and Russo were perched on a dense jungle ridgeline, the world around them a blur of green and gray. A torrential downpour, typical for the season, had turned the jungle into a roaring, liquid chaos. Below them, a Marine patrol was pinned down by a Japanese machine gun nest hidden in a tangle of bamboo and rock nearly 600 yards away. It was a difficult shot in perfect weather, a near impossible one in this deluge. The rain drove down in sheets, distorting the view through Jake's scope, making the target swim in and out of focus. Russo, his binoculars already fogged, was doubtful. "Hawk, you can't even see him clearly," Russo hissed, his voice tight with tension. "The rain's gonna pull the round down and to the left. It's a waste of ammo. We should wait for it to let up." "Quiet," Jake whispered, his voice calm and steady. He was already lost in the world of the scope, his cheek pressed against the cold, wet stock of the new rifle. He felt a strange, intuitive connection to the weapon, a quiet confidence that seemed to rise from the steel itself. It was a gut feeling, a hunter's instinct that he had learned to trust above all else. Standard training dictated he should aim high and to the right, to compensate for the bullet's drift in the heavy, wet air. But something held him back. The rifle felt like it wanted to do the work itself. Trusting an instinct he couldn't explain, he adjusted his aim less than he normally would, holding the crosshairs almost directly on the flickering muzzle flash from the enemy position. He controlled his breathing, his heartbeat slowing, until it seemed to match the steady rhythm of the rain. He became one with the rifle, a seamless extension of wood and steel. He squeezed the trigger. The crack of the shot was muffled by the storm, a flat, wet sound that was instantly swallowed by the jungle. For a long, agonizing moment, Nothing happened. The enemy machine gun continued to fire. Russo started to curse under his breath, convinced the shot had gone wide. Then, through his binoculars, he saw it. The stream of tracer fire from the nest abruptly stopped. A helmet flew into the air. Silence, deep and profound, descended upon the small section of the valley, broken only by the drumming of the rain. Russo slowly lowered his binoculars, his mouth hanging open. He turned to Jake, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and awe. You hit him," he stammered. "Dead center. How?" Jake didn't answer. He was looking at his rifle, a newfound respect dawning in his eyes. He ran a hand over the smooth, wet steel of the barrel. It wasn't luck. He knew that with a certainty that settled deep in his bones. The rifle had done something impossible. Word of the shot spread quickly through the sniper community, whispered in hushed tones in muddy foxholes and rain-lashed tents. They started calling Jake's rifle Delaney's Folly, a name that had traveled across the ocean with the crate of mysterious weapons. But here, in the suffocating humidity of the Pacific, the name was no longer spoken with derision. It was spoken with a sense of wonder, of awe, a name for a miracle made of steel. The whispers began as scattered murmurs, traded in hushed tones between exhausted men in the brief lulls between firefights. A sniper on Bougainville made a shot through a morning fog so thick it felt like breathing water, taking out a radio operator from a distance the chart said was impossible. On Peleliu, during a driving monsoon, another sniper, using one of the strange new rifles, managed to silence 3 enemy positions in as many minutes, his rounds flying true while others were being dragged down by the rain. The stories multiplied, each one adding another layer to the growing myth. The rifles, and the barrels in particular, developed a reputation that bordered on the supernatural. The name, Delaney's Folly, was now a badge of honor, a coveted title. Men who were issued one of the 50 barrels treated them with a reverence usually reserved for holy relics, cleaning them obsessively, learning their unique unspoken language. And at the center of this growing legend was Jake Mendez. Now a sergeant, his own reputation had become intertwined with that of his rifle. He was credited with dozens of high-value targets, shots that other, equally skilled men would not even attempt. He didn't talk about it, which only fueled the legend further. He simply took his rifle, disappeared into the jungle, and produced results that defied logic and training. He understood the Folly not as a flawed tool, but as a perfect one for an imperfect world. The legend was about to face its ultimate test. During a major offensive to take a strategic valley, a U.S. battalion walked into a perfectly laid trap. Pinned down in the valley floor, they were being systematically torn apart by an unseen artillery battery hidden on the surrounding ridges. The shells rained down with merciless precision, the explosions churning the mud and men into a bloody, indistinguishable mire. The battalion was being bled white, and with the monsoon raging at the height of its fury, air support was impossible. The clouds were too low, the winds too violent. An artillery duel was equally futile, as the enemy commander was expertly repositioning his guns after every few salvos, using the jungle and the storm as cover. Intelligence, gleaned from a captured map, had identified the nerve center of the operation, a fortified bunker where a high-ranking officer was directing the fire. He was located nearly half a mile away, across the rain, swept valley. Taking him out would silence the guns and save the battalion. It was a sniper's job. The battalion commander called his best men together in a leaking command tent. The mood was grim. "The shot is impossible," the captain stated flatly, his face pale and drawn in the lantern light. "That's over 800 yards in a storm. The book says it can't be done. The wind alone, not to mention the rain, you'd be lucky to hit the ridge, let alone a bunker slit." He looked around at the faces of his snipers, seeing only doubt and resignation. Then his eyes landed on Sergeant Jake Mendez, who stood quietly in the corner, his strange rifle held loosely in his hands. "Sergeant," the captain said, his voice heavy with desperation, "I know the stories, but this isn't a rumor. This is the lives of 300 men." Jake met his captain's gaze. His expression was calm, his eyes clear. "This rifle doesn't go by the book, sir," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an unshakable certainty. "I'll take the shot." A heavy silence fell over the tent. The captain stared at Jake for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of bravado or foolishness. He found none. He saw only a quiet, profound confidence that seemed to emanate from both the man and the weapon he carried. He gave a single, sharp nod. The fate of the entire battalion now rested on the shoulders of one man and a rifle born from a mistake. Hours later, Jake lay in his sniper hide, a miserable, muddy hole dug into the side of a ridge overlooking the valley. The world had been reduced to a blur of green and grey, a canvas being lashed by the relentless monsoon. The roar of the rain was a physical presence, a constant, deafening assault on the senses. The air was cold and thick, smelling of mud, wet vegetation, and the distant, metallic tang of cordite. Rousseau was beside him, his knuckles white as he gripped his binoculars, trying in vain to pierce the veil of the storm. Jake was oblivious to it all. His entire being was focused, channeled down the length of his rifle into the magnified world of the scope. The cold, wet stock was pressed so firmly against his cheek it felt like a part of his own bone structure. His eye burned from the strain of trying to find a single, stable point of reference in the swirling chaos. He could just make out the dark slit of the enemy bunker, a tiny, horizontal line in a sea of grey rock and green jungle, a target that appeared and disappeared as the sheets of rain swept across the valley. He controlled his breathing, slowing his heart, entering the state of deep, meditative calm that was the secret to his art. He became one with the rifle, feeling its weight, its balance, its strange, inner life. He didn't think about the wind, or the rain, or the distance in the way other snipers would, calculating drop and drift with cold mathematics. He thought about the Delaney drift, the secret language he had come to learn, the intuitive dance between the barrel's flawed grooves and the heavy, humid air. He didn't aim where the book said he should. He aimed where the rifle told him to. It was a feeling, a pressure, a slight, insistent pull in his hands. He moved the crosshairs to a point that seemed, to all logic, to be empty space, a spot well to the right and slightly below the target. Rousseau glanced at him, his face a mask of confusion, but he said nothing. He had seen Jake do this before. Jake let out a long, slow breath, emptying his lungs, and in the still, quiet moment between heartbeats, he squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle was sharp, yet it felt small, instantly devoured by the immense roar of the storm. A thin curl of smoke evaporated instantly in the wet air. Then there was only the sound of the rain. A long, agonizing silence stretched on, each second a lifetime. The enemy artillery continued its deadly work, the shells still screaming down into the valley below. Rousseau kept his binoculars fixed on the bunker, his body rigid. Jake lay perfectly still, his eye still pressed to the scope, his finger resting near the trigger guard. He had done his part. The rest was up to physics and fate. Then Rousseau's breath hitched. It was a tiny sound, almost lost in the storm, but to Jake, it was as loud as a thunderclap. "Hit," Rousseau whispered, his voice breaking with a raw, incredulous emotion. "It's a hit." Through the scope, Jake saw it too. The muzzle flashes from the bunker had ceased. A moment later, as if a switch had been thrown, the relentless shelling of the valley floor stopped. The sudden, profound silence was more shocking than the noise it replaced. The only sound was the drumming of the rain, a sound that was no longer menacing, but cleansing. The battalion was saved. After the war, the world tried to return to a semblance of normalcy. Soldiers came home, factories were retooled for peace, and the secrets of the war were quietly filed away. In the now peaceful halls of the Springfield Armory, a newly promoted Lieutenant Colonel Hayes filed a full, detailed report on a project that had never officially existed, Project Delaney's Folly. The report was a masterpiece of scientific analysis, complete with barometric pressure charts, humidity indexes, and high-speed photographs of bullets in flight. The physics of the useless barrel were finally, officially, understood. The accidental, artistic wave in the rifling did indeed create a unique gyroscopic effect, a counter-spin that used the density of humid air to its advantage, creating a pocket of stable pressure around the bullet that guided it with uncanny accuracy. The design, born from a single, shameful mistake, went on to influence the future of barrel manufacturing for specialized environments, its principles quietly incorporated into new generations of rifles. One crisp autumn afternoon, Frank Delaney, now gray and stooped but still carrying himself with a quiet dignity, was called into an office. He expected it to be about his pension. Instead, he found Lieutenant Colonel Hayes waiting for him, along with a few other serious-looking men in suits. And standing by the window, looking older and more tired but with a new softness in his eyes, was the now retired Sergeant Wallace. There was no public ceremony, no medal, no newspaper article. The project had been too far off the books for that. But Frank was given a quiet, formal commendation for exceptional innovation and service to the United States Army. Hayes read the citation in a clear, steady voice, his words filling the small, quiet office. When he was finished, Wallace walked over to Frank. He didn't say a word. He simply extended his hand. Frank looked at the offered hand, the same hand that had once dismissively waved his barrel toward the scrap heap, and took it. The grip was firm, the handshake one of deep, genuine respect. In that single silent gesture, years of shame and self-doubt were washed away, replaced by a quiet, profound pride that settled deep in his soul. Years passed. Frank Delaney retired, living out his days in a small, peaceful house filled with the scent of old books and lemon polish. His life was quiet, ordered, and content. One morning, a letter arrived. The envelope was worn, the postmark from a small town in Oregon he'd never heard of. The return address simply said, J. Mendez. Frank opened it with his old trembling hands. The letter, written in a neat, careful script, was a heartfelt thank you, not to a command or to the army, but to the unknown gunsmith who had made his rifle. Jake Mendez, the man from the letter, explained that he had recently been allowed to see the declassified report on the barrel he had carried, the one they all called Delaney's Folly. He wrote about the rain, the fear, and the impossible shots. He described in vivid detail the day in the valley, how that rifle, in his hands, had saved the lives of his entire company. He said he never knew who Delaney was, but that to the men who survived the jungles of the Pacific, that name was synonymous with a miracle. He just wanted to say thank you. Frank put the letter down on the table, his vision blurred by a film of tears. He looked at his own hands, old and spotted now, the skin thin as paper. They were the same hands that had once slipped in the humid workshop, the same hands that had created a useless thing. A slow, gentle smile spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. He rose from his chair and walked over to the simple wooden case that sat on his mantelpiece. He opened it. Inside, mounted on a bed of faded red velvet, was the original, prototype, useless barrel, the source of his greatest shame and his deepest pride. It wasn't a symbol of failure anymore. It was a symbol of how, sometimes, in the most unexpected and imperfect ways, a single moment of human fallibility could become a soldier's salvation. The story ended there, in the quiet light of a peaceful afternoon, with the flawed grooves of the barrel glinting softly, a silent testament to its secret, heroic journey.